Hello, class. This is your lecture on the nature of life. The outline is as follows. We'll look at a short list of the attributes of living things. We'll look at how molecules work and chemical bonds work specific to water. We'll talk very briefly about acids and bases specific to plant growth. And then we'll learn about the 4 basic macromolecules: the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. Stern comes up with a list of the attributes of living things. And every textbook has its own list, but let's go with Stern's list, which happens to be 8 attributes. Organisms from the tall redwood trees to this tiny little daisy growing in Death Valley are living things. They're plants, but they're also living things. And there are a variety of features that characterize them. Number 1, living things are composed and structured in an organized way, and that composition is in the form of cells. Cells are the basic units of life, and we know that cells have a cytoplasm, and plant cells have a cell wall that surrounds all of those living parts of the cell. 2 is growth. Living things grow, which means they increase their mass and their volume. 3 is reproduction. Living things reproduce. They can either have sex or they can do asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction for flowering plants, it's done in the flowers, right? So here's a flower on a strawberry. That's where the sex happens. But the flower is where the sex happens, but the strawberry can also do asexual. A means not and sexual. So this is where we make clones of the parents. Here's a stolon going across the ground, right? And from that runner, it can produce clones of the parent. Number 4, response to stimuli. Plants respond to their environment, including factors such as light, temperature, and gravity. In addition, plants might respond to herbivory when they get chewed on. Their first response when they get chewed on is to produce a callose. They produce this quickly. It's a polysaccharide that is made at the cell wall where the damage happened by enzymatic action. Then later over time, it deposits callus tissue. These substances protect the plant from further damage. Number 5 is metabolism. Metabolism is defined as the collective product of all the biochemical reactions in an organism. Biochemical reactions allow cells to grow, to multiply, and to do their job. Examples of metabolic reactions include photosynthesis and respiration, which we're going to talk about in detail in Chapter 10. Also digestion and assimilation. Number 6 is movement. And this one is a bit controversial because not all scientists think movement is a part of living organisms, but we're going to go with this since Stern presents it in our book. I like to include it because a lot of people don't think of plants as being organisms that move. They think of plants as growing in the ground and they move in the wind, but they don't move on their own. But it's not true. Plants can move. One example is thigmotropism. Thigmotropism is movement in response to touch. Here we can see a floral stigma. The stigma is closed here and it's opened here. When the pollinator presses its head against the stigma rapidly closes to hopefully capture that pollen and not let it get away. Also, cytoplasmic streaming. Some of you might have seen this in Alodia leaves during our cells lab. Here we can see that brick pattern of those parenchyma cells, and it's got a thick cell wall, and the cytoplasm streams around the inside, and the result means that the chloroplasts appear to be spiraling around that wall. Number 7 is organizational complexity. Here are all the levels of organization from the atom to the organism. And 8 is environmental adaptation. Natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. Organisms adapt to their environment by the process of natural selection, and we'll talk a lot more about how this works once we get to our plant evolution lecture series. Here we can see a serpentine onion in the genus Allium growing in the chaparral around campus. It grows specifically on serpentine outcrops, serpentine, which is a type of rock. It's actually our state rock. It's very poisonous. Most plants die if they grow in serpentine, but these plants are adapted to surviving in the serpentine soil. Because of that, they have very little competition. All right, so now let's talk about molecules and how molecules actually work in plants. First off, this picture has a lot going on. It shows how plants respond when fungus or bacteria tries to infect their cells. But it shows us how the plant has a variety of molecules working together to defend itself from attack. Molecules, by definition, are two or more atoms bound together. Molecules that are important to living things include carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We refer to these as the biological macromolecules, and we will talk about these carbon-based molecules later on in the lecture. First, let's talk about an inorganic molecule, which is water. Water is required for life, but it doesn't have any carbon in it. Water is essential for plants. Water is required for plants, for example, to grow, to do metabolism. How is it that water moves through plants? Well, the polarity affects the atom alignment in the water. Water is considered to be a polar molecule. Water travels in plant tissues because of these very specific properties of water. Cohesion refers to the attraction of similar molecules. That is to say, water sticks together. We call this capillary movement as water travels through those little discrete tubes called xylem up through the plant stem. Adhesion refers to the attraction of dissimilar molecules. So water molecules adhere to the inside of those capillary veins. So therefore, by having both of these properties working together, water can travel from root to stem to leaf in a completely passive process we refer to as transpiration. And just so you remember, water is also called H2O. Now, what holds together that H2O? 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. It's a very strong polar covalent bond. Polar covalent bonds mean that the electrons are shared unequally, and as such, we have a slightly positive charge on one side of a water molecule and a slightly negative charge on the other. A nonpolar molecule means the electrons are shared equally. Hydrogen bonds also form, but these form between individual water molecules. Hydrogen bonds form between positive and negatively charged areas on polar molecules, and these hydrogen bonds help hold them together. They're relatively weak, but it's enough to hold together the ocean, right? That humongous body of water that makes up most of our planet. Acids and bases are essential for plants as well. Plants evolve in specific types of soils, and those soils might be slightly acidic or slightly basic. Also, over time, acids or bases might accumulate in soil, and therefore we need to adjust that soil in order to increase our plant health. We're going to talk very briefly about acids and bases. We reserve that for a general bio or a general chemistry course. But just to make sure we're on the same page, acids are chemicals that release hydrogen ions, or H+, when dissolved in water. H+ may also be referred to as protons, and we're going to talk about those protons a lot in Chapter 10. Bases, also referred to as alkaline compounds, are compounds and chemicals that release negatively charged hydroxyl ions, or OH-, when dissolved in water. And the pH scale represents the measurement of these ions in concentration in some solution, which is usually water. We can measure the pH of soil. 7 pH is neutral, and water is usually considered to be a neutral type of solution. Less than 7 is acidic, and more than 7 is alkaline. And on your screen, you can see a picture of a kit for measuring soil pH. You don't have to memorize any of these numbers. This comes from a horticulture textbook. But I wanted to show you that it shows us different plants common to our landscapes have suggested soil pHs. For example, azalea and blueberry. These belong to the same family, the so-called blueberry family. Rhododendrons as well belong to the blueberry family. And look at the pH. It's 4.5 to 5.5. So they don't like neutral pH. They like a slightly acidic soil. Okay, so now we can move on to the last part of our lecture, which is all about the carbon-based organic molecules, the so-called biological macromolecules, the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. The first thing we need to discuss is the difference between a monomer and a polymer. And this is not in your textbook. I present this as a way to help you understand how this works. Monomers are the small building blocks of our biological molecules. Monomers could be considered a single Lego. Then you combine all of the Legos to get a larger structure. Here we're building some amazing bridge on our castle. And when we combine all of the Legos together, we have a polymer, which is composed of large molecules, and therefore gives us a large structure. As we look at the 4 biological macromolecules, we're going to learn it's all about shape. First, let's learn about the shapes of carbohydrates. The monomers for a carbohydrate are the monosaccharides. Think mono means one and saccharide means sugar. These are the so-called simple sugars, and it includes glucose and fructose. Glucose and fructose have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6, which means they have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Even though they have identical chemical formulas, notice the diagram, it's slightly different. The chemical bonds are slightly different. We don't have to memorize that, but just know that they're slightly different in their shape. The monosaccharides are the main fuel for cell work. They taste sweet. When we eat them, they taste very nice. And all monosaccharides are soluble in water. Honey, that product of the bees, very important pollinators on our planet, honey is a glucose and fructose mixture. Disaccharide, di means 2, saccharides mean sugars. This is sucrose, and this is common table sugar, that white stuff that you might sprinkle on your food or put in your coffee. It's glucose plus fructose bonded together. It's extracted from sugar cane, which is a tropical grass, or sugar beets, which we know beets are modified roots. Interestingly, the average American consumes about 150 pounds of this stuff per year. So that's a lot of sugar in our diet. It's important to plants because sucrose is the most common transport sugar in plants, translocated through the phloem. We're going to learn how that translocation of sucrose works once we get to our metabolism and water relations lectures. The polymer for carbohydrates are the polysaccharides. So it's true, disaccharides are technically poly, right, because it's more than one, but we usually call it a disaccharide and a polysaccharide. We split them into these 2 categories. So poly we'll say is more than 2. We've got starch, cellulose, and glycogen, and to understand this, let's take a look at this farmer harvesting potatoes. The potato is rich in starch, and starch is the primary form in which plants store their glucose. Next, let's do cellulose. Cellulose, we're zooming in on the leaf, but we could also zoom in on the potato, right? Because cellulose is found in all cell walls. And that cellulose is the primary component of cell walls, including primary and secondary cell walls. And then glycogen, we're zooming in on Farmer John's hand, and his skin has glycogen in it. Glycogen is the way that animals store their glucose in the form of glycogen. But at the end of the day, these are just strings of monosaccharides that are attached by chemical bonds. Cellulose is considered to be one of the most abundant organic compounds on our planet. It makes up most of the dry weight of a plant and therefore is considered a major component of the cell walls, right? Plants are just collections of cells, and every single cell is surrounded by a cell wall that's dense with cellulose. In those plants that have woody growth, which is to say secondary growth, most of the wood is cellulose. If you eat fiber in your diet, which everyone does, right? Different foods have high fiber. All you're eating is cellulose. Here's a picture of just a few of these monosaccharides that are chemically bonded. Cellulose can be a chain of up to 10,000 of these monosaccharides. Check. Now we know carbohydrates. Let's talk about lipids. The lipid monomers, but specifically the fat lipid monomers, because right now we're just talking fats, are saturated fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, and glycerols. All of these are the monomers for building a fat. The fatty acids can be saturated or unsaturated. It's all about shape. Notice that the bottom one, which is the unsaturated fatty acid, doesn't have the maximum number of hydrogen bonds and therefore has that different shape. Glycerol is a sugar alcohol. When we combine them all together, we get the polymer, which is the triglyceride. We've got our glycerol sugar alcohol backbone and 1, 2, 3 of these fatty acids. All fats are insoluble in water, so they do not dissolve in water. Another type of lipid is a wax. Waxes are lipids consisting of long-chain fatty acids bonded to long-chain alcohols other than glycerol. Waxes often bind with cutin or suberin to make waterproofing in plants. Cutin and suberin are also lipid polymers that are insoluble in water. The plant cuticle secreted from the epidermis of leaves and stems has the cutin in it, and suberin, we know, is found in the endodermal Casparian strip of the root, as well as the periderm of woody plants. That is to say, the suberin is found in the cork cell walls of the woody tissue. Another lipid is a phospholipid, and we talked about these in the cells lecture. Phospholipid bilayers are what constitute membranes. Membranes are essential for organelles and for cells. Here we can see the composition of our membrane, and based upon the hydrophilic heads and the hydrophobic tails region, it's going to limit what type of molecules may pass through it. And this is going to be essential when we talk about water relations in Chapter 9. How is it that molecules can move across cells, which is to say move across membranes? A final type of lipid is a steroid. All steroids are hydrophobic. Here's a picture of a plant and all of the different types of hormones found in plants. Hormones are types of steroids essential for signaling. That is to say, they're made in one part of the plant and then translocated to another part of the plant where they do some special job. Now, cholesterol is another type of steroid, but cholesterol is not found in plants. Cholesterol is only found in animal cell membranes. So when you see a food product that says cholesterol free and it's just a plant-based food, you can say, duh, of course it's cholesterol free. Check. Moving on to the proteins. The protein monomer is an amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and they come in about 20 different flavors. There are thousands and thousands of different proteins found in plants. However, despite that fact, they are just different types of amino acids that are chemically bonded together. So based on the order and arrangement of those 20 different amino acids, we can get thousands of important proteins. And proteins are essential for life. Proteins equals traits. How do the amino acids differ? Well, they differ based on the different side groups. We don't need to understand how that works. We save that for a chemistry course. Just know that they differ based on their chemical composition. Some amino acids are polar, meaning they dissolve in water, and others are nonpolar. When we take our protein monomers and combine them together with peptide bonds are another really strong type of bond, we grow a polypeptide. The polypeptide kind of looks like Mardi Gras beads, right? And each bead is a single amino acid. As I mentioned, these are water-soluble and insoluble. But a polypeptide is not a complete protein. After the polypeptide is produced, it spontaneously folds into a three-dimensional protein. And the bonds that allow for this to spontaneously fold are hydrogen bonds. Remember those good old hydrogen bonds? They form between the different parts of that long chain of polypeptide. Once that protein coils into a unique shape, that is when the protein is fully functional. Proteins are found in plants, but not very abundantly. For example, some plant food storage organs will store small amounts of proteins in addition to relatively large amounts of carbs. The one exception is seeds. Seeds usually contain a proportionally larger amount of protein in addition to the complement of carbs. And then looking at the seed picture, A, B, C, or D, which one is the cotyledon? It's C. C represents the cotyledon. It's this entire bean-shaped thing because, yep, it's a bean. Next is enzymes. Enzymes are special types of proteins. We need enzymes to survive. Plants need enzymes to survive. Here in this picture, we can see an enzyme that's causing chemical bonds to weaken in a substrate. 2 new chemical products are produced, and the enzyme can work again. Enzymes function as organic catalysts under specific conditions, and they specifically work by lowering the activation energy in that cell for that chemical reaction. Without enzymes, most plants would not be able to grow more than a few inches off the ground. Enzymes are essential. And our last organic molecule is nucleic acids. The monomer for a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. And the nucleotides come in 5 flavors, A, C, G, and T/U. And we say T/U because DNA has T, or thymine, and RNA has U, or uracil. When we combine the nucleotides together, we get the actual DNA or RNA strand. That is to say, DNA and RNA molecules are nucleic acid polymers, and they are all soluble in water. DNA forms a double helix structure. It's 2 complementary DNA strands, and they're complementary because the bases are complementary. C pairs with G and T pairs with A based upon the chemical formulas. And what bond forms between the complementary bases? Our good old hydrogen bond. Notice this as well. The nucleotides, which are also called those nitrogenous bases, those bases attach to a sugar backbone. RNA is different. It has a different types of sugar, and it has a different OH group. And again, I mentioned it has a different nitrogenous base as well. It has uracil instead of thymine. And this is very important when we consider how DNA and RNA work together. It's all about translating the language of DNA into protein language. This is the central dogma of biology, in which DNA is transcribed into the language of RNA, and then the RNA is translated into a protein. This flow of genetic information allows organisms to build themselves and to ultimately differentiate their cells and produce new traits. All right, so now we've talked about all of the components that I want you to focus on. If you have any questions, please give me an email. Thank you